Thank you, Joe. It's my pleasure and my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker for this luncheon. But before I do that, I would like to thank Dr. Ante Krepivnovich and the entire team at the CSBA for their partnership in putting together this summit. I'd also like to thank my Booz Allen colleagues who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to both bring the content and the logistics together seamlessly. By bringing together government and industry experts, we hope to advance the work being done to develop and deploy effective directed energy systems. This afternoon, we're honored to hear from the man in charge of the Defense Department's acquisition enterprise, a job of incredible complexity and challenge, especially in today's environment with budget pressures and increasing threats across the globe. Undersecretary Frank Kendall has made it clear that to retain technical superiority over our adversaries, the Defense Department needs to innovate. He has encouraged technical excellence and innovation in industry and government, recognizing that to achieve dominant capabilities, DoD needs to partner with the private sector. I believe that government services companies, such as Booz Allen, have a powerful role to play in supporting Mr. Kendall's vision. So over the last 3 years, we have invested heavily to become innovators ourselves and to be integrators of other companies' technology advances into DoD missions. Before ascending to his current position in 2012, Mr. Kendall served as a principal deputy undersecretary and also as acting undersecretary. He has more than 40 years of experience in engineering, management, defense acquisition, and national security affairs, spanning private industry, government, and the military. He's a distinguished graduate of West Point and served for 10 years on active duty with the Army. Mr. Kendall is an attorney and has been active in the field of human rights, working primarily on a pro bono basis. As if that weren't enough, he also holds master's degrees in aerospace engineering and business administration. My understanding is when he can take time away from the demands of his job, his passion is competitive sailing. And I understand his 36-foot Sabre is called Razor's Edge, and that earlier this summer he harnessed maybe not directed energy, but a fair bit of human and wind energy to sail Razor's Edge 473 miles from Annapolis to Newport. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, the Honorable Frank Kendall.
Thank you. The sailing references there were a surprise. That was interesting. I didn't do very well in that race, though, by the way. It's a pleasure to be with this community. It's a community I haven't interacted with very much. At about the same time, I got an email from Deputy Secretary of Work and Gary Gray asking me to kind of pinch hit for the Deputy Secretary, who's unfortunately could not be here today. I will try to channel some of his thoughts, though, and communicate some of the things that are on his mind. I thought I'd start out with a few war stories, if you will. I thought I'd start out by talking about some of my personal history in directed energy, which actually goes back quite a ways. And I think it's illustrative of perhaps in part how far we've come, but also in part how far we have not come. And that we do not have tactical operational directed energy systems today in the inventory. And our Secretary Mabus talked earlier, talked about the possibility of starting a program of record. One of the reasons that I have not spent a lot of time on DEW last few years is because there isn't a program of record for a major directed energy weapons program. I'm going to talk about my history and the history related to DW, then I'm going to get into some things that are more current events, and then at the end I'm going to try to bring them back together and challenge you, because I think the work that this community does has become much more important now. And it's very important, I think, to our security that you succeed in achieving some of the objectives that you set for yourself. So let me get to that at the end. I started my experience with, if you want to call it that, directed energy in 1976, almost 40 years ago. I was a captain in the Army, and I know many of you aren't old enough to remember that era very well. It was after the hippie era. It was kind of the disco era, if you want to go back. But I was a captain in the Army, and I was attending the Army Air Defense Artillery Officers Advanced Course at Fort Bliss. And I had to write a paper. It was frankly one of these check-the-box things where, okay, I got to do a paper. What do I write about? And so I wrote about directed energy. And I went to magazines like Aviation Week and a few others, and I pulled some material together. And I wrote about the great promise of this technology that would give us, unlimited magazines and, instantaneous kill and, be very efficient and give all this benefits to us on the battlefield for various missions. That's pretty cool. So I wrote this paper about that, about the promise of directed energy. And I passed the advanced course, so it was a success as far as I was concerned. Fast forward about 4 more years to 1980, I'm still in the Army, and I'm an aide de camp to the 2-star general who was the Army's program manager for ballistic missile defense, and also the commander of something called the Ballistic Missile Defense Systems Command. Anybody remember that back in the, okay. I'm not seeing many hands. That was at the time the Army's Ballistic Missile Defense Organization, and it was a few years after we had shut down the Spartan Sprint defense of our ICBMs in the Midwest, which we had briefly operational before the ABM treaty with the Soviets was signed in '72. It was allowed to have a limited defense under the treaty, and we kept one for a little while before we shut it down. But at that time, I was getting briefings on some of the technology that was being worked on, sitting in on the general's briefings, really. And I remember distinctly a briefing about space-based lasers. And I discovered something I should have realized being an engineer much earlier. I should have realized this, something called the absentee ratio. That's the fact that if space-based lasers in low Earth orbit are great for shooting down ICBMs that are launching, except for the problem that they're not there most of the time when the ICBMs are launched. And the ratio is something like 20 to 1. So you got to buy a lot of lasers to have one in the right place at the right time to do the job that you want it to do. So that absentee ratio is a really inefficient factor in the design of systems like that. Fast forward a couple of years, and the SDI initiative was started by President Reagan in 1983. And I can remember a lot of interest at that time in lasers, ground-based, space-based, both. And I remember one system that Lawrence Livermore came and briefed us on. And I became, by the way, by then I had moved on and I had become the Army's lead system engineer, system analyst for the ground-based part of the SDI initiative. But I remember a system called Excalibur. Anybody remember that one? Got one hand way in the back there. Excalibur, I got two. One hand, no, it's not a bit. Excalibur was a nuclear explosive-driven high-energy laser system. Concept came out of one of the DOE national labs. And at that point in time, we were still doing underground nuclear testing. And we actually did some tests to start to prove the principles associated with the idea. The idea was solid state. The idea was you have a bunch of glass rods and a nuclear weapon in the middle, and you'd let off the nuclear weapon, and all the rods would radiate, and you'd point them all at the ICBMs that were coming up, and you would zap a whole bunch of ICBMs more or less simultaneously. You can probably see there were a few engineering problems in that, but the physics was interesting, and so we did actually invest in that for a while. Come forward a few more years to 1987, and now I'm in the Pentagon, and I'm the Assistant Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Strategic and Theater Nuclear Forces, parenthesis defensive systems. And I got to do a study for the Congress on directed energy anti-satellite systems, lasers basically. And I did the study. We talked about the promise of directed energy in that and how we should be making some investments to try to fulfill that promise. And this is lost to history, but for a brief period of time, there was something called the Kendall criteria, which was the amount of watts per square centimeter you had to put on a satellite to kill it. And there was a lot of controversy about that at the time, because there was a question about what assumptions we could make about how much hardening there was, what kind of surfaces we'd impact with, how much heat would have to be absorbed, and so on in order to damage a satellite, which was obviously an important parameter and one that we didn't necessarily control. So I basically picked a number, and it became the number that was used for quite a while as the watts per square centimeter that we had to deposit on a spacecraft in order to kill a satellite. Fast forward another year or so, and I'm in the Pentagon. I'm still in the same position, and I'm sitting in my boss's office listening to a briefing, again from one of the DOE national laboratories, on electron beams. And we're getting this briefing, and sitting at the end of the table, I remember, is an older gentleman who had a staff that he was carrying at the time. And he seemed to be sleeping through most of the briefing. And as we were getting to the end, he suddenly looked up and he said the most profound thing that anybody had said the entire hour. That individual was Edward Teller. And there, of course, the lab was advertising for a program to do electron beams for, Ray Mabus would be interested in this, ship defense. And the idea was that if we invested some money in this, in a few years we could mature the technology to where we could start on a program to have a viable weapon system. Are you kind of getting the idea at this point? Next date is 1994. I'm in the same office actually, and it's my counterpart in the Pentagon, who was George Schneider at the time, who was, the titles varied, but he was essentially the Deputy Undersecretary for Strategic Forces. And we're getting a briefing on a concept called the airborne laser, which chemical laser put on a big air crane, essentially a chemical reaction writ large in space with an awful lot of plumbing and a big beam director. And people were advocating the idea of going out and building an airborne laser to do missile defense again. And I remember asking questions at the time about things like, well, okay, I'll give you the laser. Let's assume it works. How many 747s do you have to buy with lasers on them? I'm thinking about my absentee ratio again, right? To have some in the right place at the right time to shoot at the missiles when the missiles are launched, which you can't control. People said, oh, they kind of just brushed that aside and said, we really want to go build this laser. And they did. And we spent, I don't know how much money on it, but we did build the laser. Okay, fast forward now a long time. I'm going to jump ahead another 20-odd years, and here we are. I had a briefing recently in the Pentagon where I asked the R&E people, the research engineering people, to come in and give me a briefing and lay out the roadmap for directed energy. And I looked at that and I said, and I'll tell you in a minute why I was interested in that. And I looked at it, and sure enough, we have a series of demonstrations of different technologies going on, which will culminate in the next 3 to 4 to 5 years to put us in a position where, if they're successful, we can then talk about an operational weapon system development program. And the range of technologies is pretty familiar to me from the 80s. Obviously power, but also atmospheric compensation, cooling, jitter control, optics, power density, a whole host of things that are very familiar technical issues to anybody who's ever worked in this field in the last 40 years. Now, the good news is that we've made a lot of progress. Advances, in particular in things like solid-state lasers, have moved us a long way closer to the goals that we set all those years ago. But we're not there yet, so we still have more work to do. I looked at this morning at how much we're investing. It's about $300 million, you probably know that, per year right now going into programs like this. I can't promise you that's going to get bigger, but I don't think it's going to get much smaller because, as I'm going to get into in a minute, we really need the kind of capability that directed energy weapons can potentially offer us. And now I'm going to talk to you about why. I came back to the Pentagon in March of 2010. And every morning, the first thing I do is I get an intel briefing. I spend half an hour, 45 minutes going through the latest intel. A lot of that is current events. A lot of it is what terrorists are doing and others. But in my case, because of my position, I look at technical intel. What kind of weapon systems are being developed by people who we might have to fight or who might sell them to somebody we might have to fight. And I noticed very quickly that we had a problem. And the problem was the pace, the scale, and the strategic emphasis, planning behind the investment of one country in particular, and that's China, which has been investing in what we call A2AD capabilities for some time. Andrew Krapenovich is sitting here. We were talking earlier about the period right after the first Gulf War, when the United States demonstrated very dramatically to anybody who was paying any attention a new way of warfare based on a combination of technologies and operational concepts that went with them. It was things like stealth, wide area surveillance systems, networked forces, but in particular precision munitions. The ability to have a one-shot, one-kill efficiency on the battlefield and how we dealt with enemy targets of whatever type. At the time, largely ground vehicles, but also lots of other things. Nobody paid more attention to that change, that dramatic demonstration, if you will, than China. And there were an enormous number of theoretical writings in China that followed that period. And I'm sitting here with one of the world's experts on this, so I'd be careful what I say. But China has done another thing that's happening in China, besides the recognition of that conventional warfare dominance that the United States demonstrated was that China was starting to get rich. It was starting to grow its wealth at a very high rate comparatively. Fast forward from that period in time about 20 years, and I'm back in the Pentagon, and I'm looking at threat data. And I remembered, I used to get threat briefings every year. I used to do an annual week of threat briefings, basically, on technical intelligence on, at one time, the Soviets. To a lesser extent, we always looked at the Chinese a little bit, but we always kind of said, yeah, okay, they're basically buying stuff from somebody else, or they're making poor quality stuff. And I can remember at the time people saying that, you know, if in 15 or 20 years, the Chinese might be a problem, but right now you don't have to worry about them. They were right about that. 15 or 20 years later, they are a problem. What kind of a problem are they? What they are buying, and what they're well down the road to buying, is a suite of capabilities that are designed to keep us out of their part of the world. Their part of the world being the Western Pacific. That suite of capabilities includes capabilities to control space and deny us our space-based communications and sensing capabilities and PNT capabilities. It includes the capabilities to attack us with cyber weapons in various ways. It includes long-range cruise and ballistic missiles, conventional cruise and ballistic missiles designed to attack our high-value assets, particularly carriers and airfields. Logistic nodes and command and control nodes will be on that list as well. They're well down the road to doing this, and they're doing it with fairly sophisticated homing sensors that allow them to be very precise. You know, the revolution that we demonstrated in 1991, it was not unique, and a lot of people have been able to understand that and invest since then. And I think a fear I have had even since then was what's going to happen when the other guys have precision weapons too, because of our reliance on, in general, a relatively small number of fairly high-value assets as the basis for our way of fighting. So we're there now, okay? We're basically at that point. So cruise and ballistic missiles designed to counter high-value assets, very sophisticated air-to-air capability. They're working on fifth-generation fighters, which are not as good as ours, but they're also working on air-to-air missiles and electronic warfare systems that are more comparable to ours, and they're advancing those at a fairly rapid rate. Air defenses, something that we have not emphasized over the years because we've generally tended to control the air, but air defenses that are designed to prevent us from being able to do that, and in particular being designed in an attempt to counter our stealth capabilities, which have been evident again since 1991. If you take all of these things and put them together, you have a very formidable layered defense, if you will, that makes it very hard for us to project power forward. It also is a fairly formidable way to control escalation, starting with things that are non-kinetic, like jamming of space-based assets and cyber warfare, before you start to kill unmanned assets in space, and then manned assets as they approach. So it's been a concern for me for a long time. It's become a concern, I think, over the last few years of a lot of other people. We are so used, however, to the presumption of U.S. technological superiority that often when I bring this up with people, they kind of dismiss it. We don't think of China as a formidable opponent. And I haven't mentioned Russia. Russia's doing similar things. They're taking a different path operationally for different reasons. They're re-emphasizing short-range nuclear weapons in a way which is kind of concerning. But they're also building advanced capabilities that are designed, again, to keep us at bay. And precision munitions are proliferating to countries like Iran and even to North Korea that we might have a more high likelihood of getting into a conflict with at some point. And I'm not, by the way, suggesting that war with China is likely, but I am suggesting that China to continue to basically try to assert its will in the Western Pacific is very likely, and for us to have friction points out there is going on now and has been going on for some time. And the relative military balance of power affects people's behavior in those situations. There's also always the case of a possible miscalculation, and there's also the fact that China will be exporting these systems to people we might have more likelihood of facing. So that's the challenge we're facing, and we're doing it in the face of budget issues that I'm going to mention briefly. I usually give something of a rant about sequestration. I'll spare you that, other than to say that while China's budget is going up on the order of 10% a year, we're sitting here arguing about sequestration, and flat at best. And I don't know how this is going to come out. When sequestration was passed, there was a belief that turns out to have been naive that the Congress would never allow defense to be cut to the levels required by sequestration. Well, we've had that experiment, and we know how it went. And now we're in this 10-year trap we set for ourselves, where each year we go with huge uncertainty into our budget process. We asked for almost $40 billion more than sequestration would allow us in 16. 16 is not resolved. It's not close to being resolved. And I don't know when it will be resolved or if it will. We could conceivably have a continuing resolution for the next year, which, by the way, would keep us at the 15 level, which is almost identical to the sequestration level, so it's almost as bad. Plus, we can't do new starts under continuing resolution. So we really have to get out of this trap, and I guess I did do my customary rant, but you'll have to forgive me for that. It goes on, but I'll stop there. So in the face of this financial problem we have, as well as the technical operational problem that we have, what are we trying to do about it? Secretary Hagel announced something last year called the Defense Innovation Initiative, which brings together a number of things. It brings together new thinking about operational concepts. It brings together new thinking about technological possibilities and opportunities, and new ways of doing business. It spans an awful lot of things. One of the elements of that is something Bob Work is leading called the Advanced Concepts and Deterrence Program, ACDP, which is focused on some of the more stressing threats that we see out there, what to do about them. Under that, there's an effort that my office has led. Steve Welby, who's our chief system engineer and the nominee to be the assistant secretary of research and engineering, has been leading called the Long Range R&D Planning Program, which is looking at what do we invest in now that could be game changers, that could give us what Bob Work calls the third offset strategy. The first two offset strategies that he alludes to are, first of all, the use of tactical nuclear weapons as an alternative to large land forces in the 50s, and second of all, the one that I talked about earlier, which is the use of precision munitions to give a huge efficiency improvement, if you will, on conventional battlefields. We're looking for something that will give us a significant advantage. And there are a couple of problems with that. One is, in the current times, one is that we don't have the money, and the other is that technology in the world is much leveler than it was in the 70s when we did the first long-range research and development planning effort that led to the systems we demonstrated in the early 90s. So we're working it. There are some things that we've talked about that look promising. The LORDP is producing some demonstrations that we would like to fund in the next few years. They're going to have to compete with other things in the budgets. But essentially, the ability to operate from greater range is central to this. The ability to use autonomy more effectively to achieve efficiencies through that. And also quantity at cost. We're trying to reverse to some degree the trend that in the U.S., because of our requirements process, in part at least, has been to ever more expensive and smaller numbers of things as a mechanism for doing war. And that's true in space. It's true in some of our other platforms that we have bought as well, where we end up buying largely because of the cost associated with those platforms, but that combination with requirements, fairly small numbers of very expensive things. The idea is to buy large numbers of inexpensive things and use them in a different way. And then pair them with some of the things that we would buy traditionally so that they're as effective as possible together. So you mix that combination together and you start to get an idea of where we're headed with what Secretary Work calls the third offset strategy. So where in that, now I'm going to turn to this and then I'll take some questions. Where is the directed energy piece of this? The problems that we're facing are the very problems that directed energy systems have been envisioned as addressing for a long, long time. And particular precision missiles, cruise and ballistic. That's really the troubling problem for us right now because of the dependencies that I talked about. We need a higher leverage way to take out those threats than sending equally or more expensive interceptors out to intercept each missile individually as it comes in. We need to get past that paradigm and get to something that's more effective. And we can complement that with other things that improve efficiency as well. But of all the things that we need right now, that is really highest on my list. And it's not just true in the case of an ATOID problem in the Western Pacific. It's true if we're dealing with Iran near the Straits of Hormuz. It's true if we're dealing with Russia in Europe, and even possibly with North Korea with their massive amount of rockets and artillery that they can fire into the south. That's the thing we really need. And if I can focus this group on one mission, it's that one. But there are others, okay, that are where you can be valuable. I mentioned Chinese air-to-air missile developments. Defeating those threats is another place where you can be valuable. And that's not as stressing of a mission in some ways as intercepting and defeating some of the cruise and ballistic missiles. And then finally, one that I think is going to be increasingly important to the Army. The revolution that we talked about that happened in '91, the revolution in military affairs, as a lot of people call it, there was a tactical aspect of that, which is just, I think, coming into being. And it's a combination of small unmanned air vehicles and indirect fire systems that are precise in ground combat. A friend of mine recently bought a $1,000 UAV that will fly for a couple of hours, and he flies it around Washington. You may see it over your backyard someday. That's a proliferated technology now, and it's a very technically sophisticated system. This is a COTS system. It's a great targeting system, though, for tactical level of combat. And I think we're going to have to do something about that. Terrorists are starting to use these systems. So the ability to see, and by the way, I'm not going to send an F-15 with an AIM-9X or an AMRAAM to shoot that thing down. And it's not going to work, right? So there isn't an opportunity there, I think, that is an emerging opportunity. Because for our ground forces, the combination of that kind of a surveillance system with an indirect fire system that is precise is going to be very powerful. And I think our Army and Marine Corps need to be very seriously worried about that. So there's a good range there. But of all those things, the thing I would put first is helping us defeat the things that threaten the very basis of our ability to project power. Having looked at the technology a little bit, I think you still have serious challenges, but I think that there, I hate to say this because it was the same thing I read in 1976. I think with a few years' work, we have a good chance to get where we can start talking about, as Ray Mavis did, a program of record. But there are a number of hurdles before we get there. So I challenge you to get over them because we really do need that capability. And thank you, and I'll stop there. Thanks. And I think I've got, I don't know how the time is, but I take a few questions if I have time. How am I doing? I have a few minutes. My MA says one. I get one question, so make it a good one. I'll do two.
I just wanted to ask you to sort of elaborate on what you just said. You having studied this technology over the last 40 years and its evolution, what do you think the main hurdles are that have to be surmounted in the next few years? And realistically, how quickly do you think these kind of weapons could be fielded more widely?
I'm not going to make a prediction on how long. The first one is one that everybody in here is well aware of, which is to get to power levels. And a number that's been talked about a lot is something like 100 kilowatts for an operationally, packageable system. There are various ways to get there. There are various programs in the department exploring various ways to do that. There are associated issues with power and cooling and beam quality and atmospheric correction and so on that would help that equation. It's not just about power by any means, but that's one of the fundamental hurdles. The chemical lasers still, I think, have an advantage there in terms of raw power, but the fiber and solid-state lasers are coming up relatively quickly, and I think you have a chance to get there. And there are a variety of technologies that are being worked in that.
Thank you. Bruce McDonald, Johns Hopkins University. I wanted to thank you very much for your comments about China. I think it's a very timely warning. I've spent the last 10 years of my career working on strategic technology and the threats and challenges we have from China, so I welcome it very much. I was just at a conference this past weekend with what's called a Track 2 dialogue with the Chinese in Honolulu. And there were some PLA people there as well. And one thing that comes clear is that they watch what we do, as you know, very carefully, just like
Yes.
we watch what they do. The subject of the conference was cross-domain deterrence, one of the big new buzzwords. And I wanted to ask you if you thought that, looking at the question about, it's not just nuclear and conventional anymore, it's throw in space and cyber and whatever. Do you see more opportunity than danger, or more danger than opportunity for the way that these multiple domains work? It's not like two-dimensional chess, it's like four-dimensional chess, it seems. And what are the chances you see of it being, there's a chance, despite sequestration, that we could take advantage of that, or do you think that we might end up, because we can't spend the money or increase in budgets like they can, that it could end up biting us? So what's your sense of the cross-domain area?
Real quickly, I'm less worried about the crossover between nuclear and conventional in China than I am with Russia. Russia now has a doctrine about use of tactical nuclear weapons as a relatively low threshold in certain scenarios, which is troubling. In a way, they're kind of going back to our scenario from the 50s. China's investments in strategic deterrent have been comparatively modest. Their numbers are much smaller than the Russian numbers. And they have, I think, followed a policy which is that they want to have a second strike deterrent capability. They're not interested in a first strike capability. So I'm less concerned about China. We're not engaged in and have not engaged in, to my knowledge, strategic arms reduction talks with China because of their inventory being relatively small. Russia is a different situation, and I think Russia is trying to compensate for their own economic shortfalls and the shortfalls of their forces, their conventional forces, by tactical nuclear weapons, which is, I think, a dangerous route. So that's the way I see that equation. I had one over here, then I'll have to go.
Sir James Drew from Flight Global. You talked a little bit about the Strategic Defence Initiative and some of the architectures for ballistic missile defence that we saw presented earlier had a real Star Wars feel. Do you think that we are back on that path towards developing and fielding a fully integrated ballistic missile defence system that includes space-based weapons? And then secondly, could you just tell me who won the bomber competition? Was it Northrop or was it Boeing?
I'm not going to address the second part of your question. Our missile defenses, our national missile defenses, are basically designed for relatively unsophisticated threats. They've been focused on North Korea in particular and the possibility of an Iranian threat, not a massive Russian or even a Chinese-sized threat. And the reason for that is the economics start to kill you when you start trying to buy interceptors and radar systems that you then have to defend in order to have a viable defense. And the department, quite honestly, is looking at where we are relative to a reasonable stopping point, if you will, for the kind of defenses that we've been buying. And it's tied into the sophistication and the numbers of the threat that you have to face. I'm an old air defender from the Army, and a rule of thumb, if you're defending against missiles of whatever type, and by the way, reentry vehicles or doing intercept and boost phase, which you might try to do from space, are both very hard problems. A really good air defense system might get a 70% probability of kill. If you're trying to intercept all the nuclear weapons that are being shot at the United States, that's not a very good number to work with if those numbers are large, the numbers of attackers are large. So I don't foresee a Star Wars-like vision being fulfilled anytime soon, even if we get much more powerful lasers. I don't see that happening. Sorry to give you that bad news, but that's the way I see it. Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.